Hello and welcome to episode 11 of the Voice Break podcast. Today we have a visionary. Sean, welcome to the stage.
Starting off with the compliments. I appreciate that. Great to be here, Tristan.
Absolutely. And I say you're a visionary because I've seen your work on YouTube is just like, it's more than eye candy. Like, you have to polish every shot. I don't know how you do it, but I'm eager to learn.
Thank you, man. That's so kind of you. I'm grateful. I'm just coming off a week of NAM activities, and it was so positive there, meeting so many folks either in the industry or the public who wanted to like get to know me better, and the companies I work with too in the guitar and gear space. So I'll just throw that on the pile of my gratitude. So thanks again. Great to be here.
Absolutely. Well, happy to have you. And well, clearly you have a lot of guitar experience and a lot of gear experience. Tell us about that. Like, kind of how did that whole journey come about?
Yeah, it's I was lucky enough to grow up with a father that knew how to play guitar, and is a great rhythm player and a great singer, and so he has a still does has an amazing voice that kind of takes over any room even without a microphone involved, kind of a Paul Bunyan level voice, so that was great. And growing up, he played so many songs around like the table at night, and so our dinners would last hours and hours, kind of thing. And we're Italian and Irish, and so there's a lot of traditions around, the dinner table is kind of like the arena, where everything happens. And so he would play so many songs, and when I was little, I kind of thought they were all his songs. But then I learned who the Beatles were, and kind of who the Eagles are, and some bluegrass stuff, because he was always taking me to bluegrass festivals when I was growing up. But I sometimes I take it for granted when folks DM me and say, "Hey, how do you approach improvising?" Because I'm a big improviser in what I do. And I take it for granted that everybody didn't grow up with a father who knew how to play to teach them all the getting off the ground knowledge of guitar, because there's a lot of it, right? Tuning and restringing and setups, and cowboy chords versus bar chords, and that's just getting started. So I was lucky to start with that. And I was around 11, so I just hit 30 years of playing guitar, which blows my mind. I remember hitting 20 and going, "Oh man, I can't believe it's that many." And now we're 10 years later, So it's great. I remember opening my dad's album cabinet, and his was in this big, tall, like almost entertainment towers in the living room. And there was two locks on each cabinet there. One of them was alcohol, and the other lock was vinyl. And so the kids kind of could never get in there, and we'd constantly tried with our grubby mitts to get into anything we could.
Yeah.
And then one day he opened up the vinyl, and that's when I was like, wow, we just spent all day of a rainy Saturday or Sunday, kind of like today, and just played a bunch of Hendrix records. And and every Hendrix song just pulled me in with like, it wasn't just the songwriting, it was like the sound design and the experimentation. And like the first time you hear Voodoo Child, Slight Return, and the wah pedal intro. And so I immediately just started, I went kind of straight from cowboy chords into blues scales, into trying to learn what these people who were so much more experienced than me were, like SRV, Hendrix, etc. And so then I kind of fit in as like a lead player with my dad to start out with. So I was always looked to for every lead break that would come up in a song that he'd be playing. So yeah, it's led to a great relationship, and we still play together all the time. So it's very cool.
Wow, that's really awesome. So in that era, that probably, I don't want to date you, but I know that around
I can date you for it. So this is
okay,
probably 1990, going into
1990.
all the way up till my discovery of Radiohead and grunge, kind of in '93 onward, kind of thing. So yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's one of my favorite times. Of course, I wasn't around through the whole 90s, but around that era when the internet wasn't like in everyone's pocket, and you didn't know about certain musicians, certain bands, like it just wasn't a thing unless you grew up around people who could educate you.
Right.
So
Do you remember your record collection being like a signifier of your taste? And it was almost like an arms race with all your friends, and then you realize that everybody's collection is your collection too. Especially when CD burning happened.
Oh
Uh, there,
yeah,
was, there were all these little micro steps that we forget on the way to where we are now, but CD burning was a huge one.
yeah, yeah.
So
It was my dad is like a huge computer nerd. We grew up with we grew up with all that stuff. It was CDs, floppies. Actually, he works in IT, so
nice.
but yeah, just CD burning was like a staple of what we did, and we got on LimeWire and all that sort of jazz.
Yeah, totally.
But I find it so much a blessing to have grown up in an era where there's a rarity to music, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah, you talk about you and I aren't the same age, but we remember the world before the internet
Hmm.
and kind of now with the internet, right? And so
Yeah.
it's I used to collect Radiohead singles from Japan and from Europe and all these maxi singles that you couldn't get in the States. And so every time you found one, you almost blinked your eyes. You couldn't believe you were looking at it. You're like, oh, I don't have this one yet. What are the B-sides on this one? And then no one else had those B-sides, right? You couldn't get them. And I don't know that I miss it because it's pretty awesome now to be exposed to everything at once all the time. But
Mm.
there was a certain I'd be a different person if I didn't go through that. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Hmm.
And I don't know if you feel the same, but yeah,
Oh, I agree 100%. I can't imagine growing up today where everything is at fingertips. Like,
yeah. I mean, like, what about Harmony Central and Olga versus YouTube, right? I mean, having to figure out if some dude or girl who tabbed out this song is even close to what Stone Temple Pilots are doing, right? And then you playing it wrong for the next 20 years because you never bothered to really listen to it, right? We all have this imprint of Harmony Central in our heads of what we thought it was in plain text, or at least I do.
yeah, yeah. Wow. No, that's interesting. Okay, I'm not very much a guitarist myself.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I wasn't a I wasn't really into music in much of a sense until I was 21, actually.
Oh, wow. How'd that come
So
about?
how'd that come about?
Yeah. I'm going to interview you now. How's that?
Yeah, yeah. So, well, it's a long story. When I was 8 years old, I had this experience, right? So my family, we just came home from some errand or another, I'm not sure. And I was alone in our office over there, sitting on the plush vanilla carpet. I was just doing nothing, just
That's a
relaxing.
risky carpet to have kids with.
It actually was not bad. Like nothing ever happened with that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but I remember just like kind of stream of consciousness, just dilly dallying, and the song that we were playing in the car or was playing was going through my head, and I'm like I did this look. I was like, what was that? It's Alicia Keys. I'm almost positive. Alicia
Mhm.
Keys. Just a very rich belt, straight tone. Pretty simple, actually. But to me, it was like there was this tone of unfamiliarity in my like emotional space. I was like, how do they do that?
This is the first time a song really grabbed you and made you think about how, pretty much.
Yes. And
Nice.
so funny story. Until like this past week, I misinterpreted that confusion. I thought I wanted to understand, but I actually wanted to just experience it firsthand.
Sure.
So I didn't start studying until 13 years later when I was 21.
So was it
After 7 years of study.
experiencing it firsthand? Was that like I want to go see Alicia Keys in concert, or was it like I just want to have a CD of this thing that was on the radio, and now I want to own the CD or something
Oh no, 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 no. I wanted to experience the voice. Like
in,
what
in person?
in my own body.
In your own body.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
how would that feel like kind of thing.
Sure. Sure.
So it took me 7 years of study to realize I didn't want to understand per se. I just wanted to experience it. It's pretty ironic, but along the way, I did pick up a little guitar. My therapist actually gave me hers. I
Oh
still
wow.
have it over there. I haven't done much with it. I'll be honest.
Well,
Sorry, Deborah.
it's among the most portable accompanying instruments, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you don't need a speaker for it. You don't need a moving truck to move it. So I think it's a good thing in that way.
yeah,
That's cool though. What kind of
yeah.
guitar did she give you?
It's an acoustic. I'm not sure what. It's freaking huge, is what it is. Like I can hardly fit it in my lap. But then I found out that like really classical is meant to be played almost upright. So I was like, oh, that actually feels a lot better.
Oh, is this like a nylon string vibe?
Steel.
Steel. Okay, got it.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
So that was tough. Then I got into ukulele because I was like, man, like my wrist is not working with this right now, but I do want to learn. So I got a uke a few years
Yeah,
ago, and so I started noodling with that and just like playing around, like finger style,
yeah.
just having
I
fun
mean, I
again.
think it was George. This is well quoted by now before me, but I think George Harrison from the Beatles is a huge. Like, I think he wanted ukuleles in every room of his house, and I guess for his house, there's a lot of rooms, right? So you can imagine the number of ukuleles there were, but
Yeah,
he would be having collaborators and friends over for dinner, and he just wanted to be able to reach over and grab one and start a song at the table. So ukulele, I mean, you probably know this already, but it's a subset of the guitar, right? It's like the fifth fret up on the highest four strings. So all the investment and time you put into the ukulele is actually applicable to the guitar. It's just that when you play guitar, you get two more bass strings on top and roughly five more frets of uh, lower sounds to play.
right,
So yeah,
right.
which is helpful, you know.
It is, and I think the fun part is navigating the difference with the inner strings being the lower on ukulele,
Right. If you play
where
ukulele and come to guitar, you're suddenly going to realize that you have a lot of muting to do on the lower strings, so you don't get this lower guttural
yeah,
sound on top of the chords you're used to. But
yeah,
I always find myself having to revoice chords because I don't have the low strings. Because whether we know it or not, I think a lot of guitar players end up anchoring their knowledge to the low E string. And once you take away the low E string, you're like, wait, everything's kind of two frets higher than I remember, and now that G to B tuning differential is right in the middle of the range. So it's interesting though. I think it's really fun to pick up instruments that like it's actually the same thing as like a baritone guitar. If
hmm
you play baritone, you're down like a fourth, so you're playing in B standard instead of E standard. So you pick up another five frets lower, and it's still six strings. So when you pick up one of those, it's really gratifying because you're like, I feel like I got this new instrument, this new sound. I already know how to play it completely. But of course, then when you jump in with other people and try and map your E standard centric knowledge to ukulele or to baritone, you have some remapping to do because you're so used to anchoring off of the fret range you're used to and the tuning you're used to. So
wow,
yeah, it's a
that's
lot,
super
but
interesting.
it's really cool. Yeah.
I didn't know about baritone guitars.
Yeah, you never heard of those? Oh man,
Not at
it's
all.
they're very in vogue right now, and I can't credit any single player with that, obviously, but the rise of what I'll call gear nerd musicians who cross over into mainstream artistry.
Uh,
And the two names that come to mind for me with that are Ariel Posen and Joey Landreth. I don't know if you know them at all, but if you spend any time in the gear community and watch YouTube and Instagram, you will see Joey Landreth and Ariel pop up. They actually used to be in the Brothers Landreth band together, and I think Ariel would tour with them. Anyway, they're both amazingly nice people and really, really gifted songwriters. So I'd recommend that anyone who wants to become familiar with baritone guitar start with uh, Joey Landreth and the Brothers Landreth and Ariel Posen's records because they also play slide in open tunings like open B, open C. And slide has a way different voice when you're starting from a more guttural uh, baritone tuning. It's not as shrill when you hit the upper frets on the high strings. So really, really cool stuff. I definitely recommend checking that out. But those guys are a lot of people are just getting into them right now. They don't know that they were kind of huge in the gear scene, and now they're fully crossed over into artistry. So
Wow.
Joey Landreth actually, with his brother, they wrote a song that got picked up by Bonnie Raitt, and then Bonnie Raitt won. She like won awards for that song, so it was like really cool to see that for them.
That's awesome.
They're
Wow.
very
Yeah, no, I mean, gear is like a rabbit hole, and it's interesting to see that there is some crossover there in that
totally.
regard.
It's a tough
Yeah.
leap to make, though. It's you get known for one thing and get pigeonholed, I'm sure. But the
Yeah.
first time I saw Joey, he was on this amazing YouTube show called That Pedal Show. And I know this audience of this podcast is not necessarily guitar players, but if you're ever looking to learn anything about guitars and amps and signal chains and pedal boards and how to set things up, I learned almost everything I know from That Pedal Show. But that was the first time I saw Joey, and Ariel's been on that show a bunch of times too. So I totally recommend checking that out if you're guitar adjacent or guitar curious. But don't blame me when you're a couple $1,000s in buying boutique pedals and gear. So
Oh, it's so true. I'll keep that in mind because, well, I I'm not that big into guitar playing per se. I mean, I like it, but I do know a couple of my friends are a few $1,000s in already,
yeah,
and yeah, I'll give that to them as a Christmas present. It'll just be the YouTube channel.
what's dangerous about it is you can get a couple $1,000s in and realize you were completely on the wrong track because you talked to an employee at Guitar Center. No shade to them, but everybody has their genres they're into and their tastes and what worked for them. But what works for the sales employee you're talking to is not necessarily your genre or your taste, right? So, and every part of it changes, like the guitar, the pickups, the wiring, the amp, the pedals. Like if you change any one of those things, everything else will sound different, which is a blessing and a curse when you're starting out. So that's where YouTube and shows like That Pedal Show really help, because there's a whole episode about why Vox amps versus Fender amps versus Marshall amps, and you actually get to hear what they sound like with different pedals, which when I was a kid, you'd have to go buy all those things and try them, or go to a guitar store. You don't have your guitar with you to plug in. So now you're playing a foreign guitar into a foreign amp you're considering buying, and you're like, yeah, this sounds great. Then you get it home. It doesn't sound anything like what you did in the store because all the variables have changed, right? And you just dropped all of your saved up money on something that doesn't work, right? So we romanticize about the 90s, but
Yep. Yeah.
there's also these downsides to it
Yeah.
where you could not sample this stuff before really taking the plunge. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of benefits to the convenience of the modern age, and even more so with AI, where now plugins and that sort of thing is getting to the point where some people don't use like rigs at all. It's crazy.
yeah, I mean, there's a whole debate in the gear world, the guitar world, about virtual setups, right? Like
Yeah.
cab simulators and digital preamps. And it's when I first got into this in like 20, I mean, I was always into this, but when I re got into it after years of playing acoustic guitar, um, the digital stuff was cool because it cost very little and you could play any rig you can imagine. You can configure the signal chain digitally, but it didn't sound quite right. And I think that was probably 2015. Um, it's very good now. Like it's really to the point that if you were listening to a mix of an album you liked, you really couldn't point at it and know that someone used all simulators and cab sims, not real mics and real amps in a room. But I think the difference is like we're not just playing guitar to imitate what we hear on albums. We're playing guitar to get inspired, and part of the inspiration is how it feels under your fingers in the moment. So
Mm.
we're doing amazing things with emulations now, and I do stay very close to that world. But for me, I'm much more impressed and like inspired to play a real tube amplifier through like a cabinet and mic it up with real mics. That being said, like I'm into technology that allows me to push the analog world further using digital. So like for instance, when I was a kid, you buy an amp and then you turn it up. You can hardly get to one before you're hurting your ears and you're hurting everybody else's ears around you, right? And these days, like they invented, this has been around for a while, but like attenuation. You would plug in an attenuator between the amp head and the cabinet. It would soak all the volume up and release it as heat energy. And there you can push the amp harder so it sounds great. And for singers, that's the difference between a breathy whisper and blowing out your voice box and, getting a scream on. You kind of, with an amp, you want it to be working hard generally. But by the time you're screaming, it really is bad for all your relationships of people who live within 100 feet of your house, right? So these attenuators are great, but the problem is when you push your amp to a certain amount, then you want to run a delay like echo in the front of it, or reverberation or reverb as we call it. It then cooks the delay and the reverb. And so it sounds all broken up and kind of not smooth and clean the way you would expect those ambient effects to sound. So this one that I use with this amp, it actually has an effects loop in it that lets you kick the front end of the amp really hard, get that breakup, which is what my channel is named for, Edge of Breakup, and
Aha.
then throw all of the effects in the effects loop so that it happens post amp head. And all your echoes and reverb and ambient effects sound very pristine and clean the way they should. So that's kind of, I have found this space where I'm very happy with the rig now. I can demo anything I want. If someone sends me a reverb pedal or a delay pedal, it can be heard with a pushed amp without it being in danger of cooking the effect and not sounding so great by heading into a pushed amp. So
That's really
that
cool.
was pretty technical for a non-guitar podcast, but I just want, like, I spent years wondering how people do this without like getting evicted from their house because of and this is a way that you can kind of play at like 100 decibels or 105 decibels max, and you can record with real mics and you won't hear the plunky strings from the mic because it's loud enough to drown this out,
Hmm.
but it still sounds great. So yeah,
Wow.
so that's an example of using modern technology to push the analog past further. And I like that very particular micro brew
Yeah.
of strategy. So
Well, I think that's brilliant. And to me, that makes perfect sense. Of course, I have a lot of experience failing and learning with production and software and that sort of thing. So I got to know firsthand what post and what pre is and effects and all that stuff,
sure, yeah, absolutely.
despite a lack of electric guitar experience. But actually, it's funny, a lot of my students are actually guitarists. So, well, it just kind of works out that way.
They're looking
But
to find a way to accompany themselves as they sing, probably, I would imagine.
yes, yeah.
Nice.
I find a lot of guitarists, a lot of my students who are guitarists, I ask them like, what's it like? Because I noticed this trend. Like, it's not just a small minority or a super minority. It's the vast majority of my students. And I'm like, what gives? And a lot of them are thinking like, I got this guitar skill and I want my voice to be as good.
Yeah. I
I'm
mean,
like,
it kind of cuts both ways, right? It's like you're a singer and you don't want to rely on a backing band, and you can start getting more gigs if you can accompany yourself with guitar at like a coffee shop or like a open mic or whatever. Or you're a guitarist and you're like, man, it would be really cool if I could write some songs to go with this, right? Or find some way to map my physical fretboard knowledge to here, you know?
yeah,
So it's
yeah,
fascinating. Everybody has different goals and had different starting place. But I've always have a dream that like one day I'll really be able to sing. Like I was just making my kids lunch just now, and I had like Temple of the Dog with Chris Cornell on, and I was just like, I can't even. There's like a big difference between singing with an album versus running the song yourself. Because when you're
hmm
singing with an album, you're almost tracing over someone else's pencil lines with ink. But when you try and do it yourself, copying Chris Cornell is like, forget about it. It's
Trust me,
unbelievable.
I know. Actually, Chris Cornell is one of the voices that stood out to me when you could say when I discovered music. Because until then, until like beyond the experience I had when I was 8. I didn't really listen to music like that. Like, could just kind of, put it on the background, whatever. Music is cool.
Sure.
Started studying it, and then, well, actually, it was a little before I started studying. Now that I think of it, it was grunge, because Pearl Jam was like the first
Oh
band that
yeah.
was like, whoa, this is a band.
Yep.
Bands exist.
Yeah.
And
What album was that? Was that 10 or was that Versus?
it was 10.
Okay.
And it's funny because my parents, they were like, oh yeah, we love Pearl Jam. Like, what are you talking about?
Well,
I've
they're
never
probably
heard it.
fans of The Who or something, right?
Yeah, like, and I had this thing where any music that my parents liked, I couldn't like, because I'm like, well, that's not cool.
I never had that. It's so funny. So many people experience that, but I
Yeah,
think it was because before I ever had my own music taste, I liked what my parents played on instruments.
yeah,
Cool. Like
yeah, that makes
then
sense.
we would do snowboarding trips and camping trips, and inevitably have a 7-hour drive in front of us, and they would let me disc jockey as much as they did. So we had this is back in the day where we had tapes that if you let them run to the end, they would just flip over and start again. You know. So I think I had
Oh,
Pearl Jam 10 on cassette in my dad's truck. And then he would throw on Bonnie Raitt. So then I would hear a little bit of that. Um, yeah, it's just a great. Anyway, I totally identify with the Pearl Jam lighting a fire when that first happened. It was like, wow, what is this?
yeah, yeah, yeah. It was. I don't know. It was an experience. Like, so around a lot of change was happening around the time we were about to move out, and
Mm,
that wasn't something I really experienced before. I don't know why, or honestly how, but it was just a song on the radio. It was on Sirius at the time,
sure.
and I was like, I've never heard that song before. And they're like, oh yeah, we listen to that all the time. I'm like, what are you talking about? Because they did listen to Nirvana, Metallica, and stuff like that.
You had awesome parents that didn't even know it.
I know, and it was like, what do you mean? So I heard the song, and then at the time, I just got a phone. So this is where technology is actually good, because I didn't have to get the album and put in earbuds, and I was listening to freaking Even Flow again and again. I'm like, I'm feeling something.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because my dad was exposing me to not only Hendrix, but Stevie Ray Vaughan at the time. And then I find out years later that Mike McCready was just trying to, like, I mean, in his own words, I'm not saying he's an imitator because he's an
Yeah.
innovator, but
Hmm.
his own explanation of his playing in interviews has been like, man, I was just trying to play Stevie Ray Vaughan licks over, kind of, they were rejecting like glam 80s rock in a way, right? I think. But the funny thing is that Pearl Jam wasn't a band like Nirvana, where Nirvana was like pretty much sticking to the vocal line. That was and very, very simple, but very emotional
Hmm.
guitar lines as solos. Like Pearl Jam does have moments of simplicity, and those moments are poignant and they're great, but Mike McCready is not a slow player. He's
Yeah.
incredible. So you can really hear the Hendrix influence, obviously.
Oh
And
yeah.
and John Frusciante is the same way almost. I put those two guitarists very close together in terms of my interests in the 90s.
Hmm.
So many riffs and memorable parts from those two guitarists for sure. But yeah, the Hendrix influence lives on. It's amazing.
To this day, to this day. I mean,
Oh yeah,
you hear guitarists, like, even the new wave, so to speak, of guitarists with Polyphia and, oh, what's it called? Tosin.
yeah, amazing.
And insane playing, and you wouldn't think there's like a correlation there, but I'm sure you've seen the interview with Rick Beato between I think it was the four of them, and
Sure.
every one of them were like, Hendrix. I mean, it was Hendrix.
Yeah,
Like, to
I
this
know.
day.
I mean, as the owner of a YouTube channel, you cannot imagine the amount of hate and comments that just flow through along with the good stuff, right? And
Hmm.
so whenever you talk about Hendrix in a video or you throw out some Hendrixisms on guitar, you have people claiming that like Hendrix was sloppy. He wasn't even that good. I mean, they do it to Jimmy Page too. It's like, you guys, like, you have no historical context for how important this was. Like, without those things happening when they did, all of the influence, like all of the bands that then learned from them, that then had 3 or 4 generations of influence to get to what you like now. Like, this is a Marty McFly situation where if Hendrix didn't exist, the newspaper article and the photograph would totally change. Like,
Yeah.
your little micro subgenre that you think is great would just evaporate, probably. So, so I'm venting a little bit because every channel owner has to deal with these comments all day
Yeah.
long. You just got to laugh at them sometimes because, oh boy. But I think, like, when it comes to Hendrix, you're never done learning it. You might learn the song, and the first level of sketching that is the chords, right? And then all the triads, and then the voicings of the chords. And then once you know which voicings you're playing, then it becomes very clear quickly which riffs are adjacent to the right voicings. And by voicings, I mean inversions, right? It's like,
Hmm.
am I going to sing the third in the bass, the root in the bass, or the fifth in the bass, or whatever? But on guitar, you can sound like you're pseudo playing the right riffs, but you're not actually inverting the chord the right way. So everything's a little out of reach. When you click it and find it, you're like, oh my God, this is totally what they were doing. Because everything I need for this riff is right within the same fret range I'm on. And even once you learn that, you revisit it. You think you know it. You go back and you hear all these little nuances it might be the way they like wipe the neck before they go into a lick. It might be the way they palm mute and pick a note before they launch into that full step bend. And I think that's when you get into like almost the vocal nuance of who a guitar player is. It's not just learning the notes they played, but the way they played them. And I'm
Hmm.
sure you probably have that experience with singing too, where you every time you sing a song, you're increasing the fidelity of it by 1%. And it might take 10 years to really appreciate every little nuance that an artist does, right? And
Oh
that's just
yeah.
how they sang it that day, is the crazy shit. They didn't know that take would become the take. But if you heard Hendrix play Little Wing a week later, we would have heard a whole different set of improv licks and ideas. And now we study it like canon, right?
Yeah.
So it's really that's fascinating to me to think about. If the weather had been different that day, if they'd been late to the session or early to the session, or if it couldn't happen until next week, what would we have heard get laid down on tape? You know,
Yeah. And made history forever. And like almost like a tower everyone can still see in terms of like guitar. If guitarists and their legacy is like a tower, it's just you can see it from everywhere.
100%. But again, I really think that it's kind of nothing without the song. That's kind of and that's not a unique take, but it is a take that I identify with. Like, guitar is not sports. Guitar is not athleticism. It's not numbers of notes per second. And I probably say that growing up as someone who was born in the 80s but came of age in the 90s during grunge and was kind of rejecting the 80s flash.
Hmm.
I can appreciate it, and I think it's amazing what some players can do. But I think that generally speaking, I'm much more of an appreciator of a great song rather than, you know, just shredding for a bunch of minutes. I can obviously I have an appreciation for it, but I'm also not an incredibly fast player myself. So maybe it's me projecting my own inadequacy. Who knows?
Well, there's a reason for preference, and I tend to feel the same way towards playing. Like,
Mhm.
maybe it is I feel a bias towards slower things because, like, man, I don't want to struggle on hard stuff that's like really fast. Mind the fast stuff can be very true and poignant, but vocally the identity is like I feel a bit weightier, if that makes sense. So not quite so athletic and
Or
agile.
maybe the athletic part, or maybe the speed has a moment where it drives the emotion and you work up to it rather
Hmm.
than it being a constant. You know, I
Hmm.
think that's something I try and with the guitar. It's very funny. Like, you can tell a story down here a certain way, and then that story kind of raises in intensity when you get here,
Mm-hmm.
and then faster and faster, and before you know it, you're up here. So I had to learn with guitar storytelling and lead playing that you don't really want to start up here, because that's like starting with your head voice almost, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it kind of doesn't leave you anywhere to go. And so it's the antithesis of like climax and anticipation to then move down from here. Now there are some great guitar breaks that start here, they climb up, and then they have a breakdown where you kind of drive back to the basics again and play more rhythmically.
Mm-hmm.
And really these are general rules. People break them all the time. But yeah, it's fascinating. There as many stereotypes as there are out there about how to do something. There's always new players coming out that'll challenge that and totally shatter those rules. So I'm sure
Absolutely.
singing is the absolute same in that regard. So
Absolutely. That's a really it's a really fun subject because now we're here where we can see pretty much everything going on. Everything new that happens it's not a secret. It's like with the Olympics is no different because the standard or the rate of change, the rate of progress in the peak, the top 0.0001% of performers, it's like exponential every generation
or
these days.
or it's more visible all the time now, right? Like
Right.
maybe it was always there, but in order to break through and even have us on a podcast talking about how good you are, you'd have to have a record label. I mean, just the fact that you even have a podcast alone, you didn't have to go get a radio show and get
Yeah.
backed by a major corporation. It's the same thing, right? It's like
Hmm.
it's there's so much talent out there now, and it is being channeled towards, like, in order to be an artist, you have to be a creator now. We hear this. I've heard this on a lot of podcasts, a lot of YouTube shows lately, and it's very true. Like I am not technically a music artist. Like I rep a channel that cares deeply about design, photography, cinematography of guitar gear and adjacent gear around guitar. And so, but there are a lot of folks out there that during COVID, they used to play gigs, release albums, go on tour, or be studio musicians, but then COVID shut everything down. They had no choice but to then make videos and hawk gear, right? Or either that or education was another space that a lot of guitarists jumped into. And luckily, platforms like Patreon and others kind of gave them a way to monetize those moments, right? And then Instagram kind of becomes like the fish food to attract people to the paid experience, or to YouTube where it's monetized, let's say, or
Yeah.
you have like a pro section you pay for. But I know a lot of folks who I've just become friends with on Instagram or YouTube, and it was tough for people to give up what they know livelihood wise, playing live because of COVID, and then just go strictly to an educational space. And then when things changed, they kind of had this other part of their life. And some people just picked it up and said, okay, I'm done. I'm going to go back and play gigs. And then other people kind of kept the side hustle around with gigging and with all that. So it's
Yeah.
really interesting though. It's like we're expected to wear so many hats these days.
Yeah.
Um, did you find any of that in your life when things kind of changed with COVID? Like, did it affect the way that you execute on music or the way you?
Man, it changed everything. It changed everything.
Did
In
it launch the podcast?
well, in part, yeah. In part, yeah. Because of that. But I actually didn't start teaching until COVID happened.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah. So just like you're saying with the education space, I had a lot of doubts with music. And pretty much the past 7 years have been like, God, what does this mean to me?
Right.
Because creativity had never been a question before. Whenever someone asks me, what do you want to be? I'm like, there's no answer to that. Like, I don't have an answer.
You weren't really sure still.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so purpose was an enigma to me. But COVID gave me an opportunity, and I'm actually very blessed because nothing happened to my family
Yeah,
anywhere,
right.
even extended family.
Yeah,
So
but
I
to be
was,
clear, we're not romanticizing COVID here. It was terrible. It's
yeah,
just that there were these like vestigial effects of it that changed the way society worked, right? In different
yeah,
ways.
it did. And with change comes opportunity. So there's one thing I realized was that, like, aside from talking about singing, I was depressed. I was like, I don't know what I want to do with this. And I didn't have a purpose that was shining bright, like, this is what you want to do. I
But
realized the
you
only time
were
that,
you singing well, in your opinion, were you singing well at that point in your life when that happened? Or were you, I mean, you're always on your journey, right? You're always getting better. But
Mhm.
had you performed before? Had you recorded before?
you know, I had performed and I have infinitely more experience failing in performance than I do with succeeding.
Sure. I mean, that's how it goes. You know,
Yeah,
you have to get through that. Definitely.
absolutely. And so, yeah, there was a lot of doubts. I would say I was singing well technically, but not singing well according to my preferences. So part of it was like, what do I like? What would I like my voice to be like?
Yeah.
So talking to my mom about just the way singing works, as I understood it, was the only thing that was very enlightening to me. Like, this is actually fulfilling. So because of that, I realized I needed to teach. It was no question. Like,
I
I have
love
to do it.
teaching. That's great.
It's
Every time I teach, and this is a cliche, but every time I teach, I learn something new. And it may not be new, but it might be like a different way to explain something, a different way of looking at something. And I always benefit from it, whether or not the other person does. Um, hey, by the way, is singing like this? Because in guitar, I or I guess in music in general, there's this trope that your heroes didn't know what they were doing. So you don't have to know what you're doing. It's all about the expression of your heart and the moment and do what you feel, right? And I
Mm,
think there are two very different, maybe more than two, maybe it's a spectrum, but I have always been very interested in how it works and why it works. And there's a lot of pushback on that kind of thinking in the music community because it's like, well, Hendrix didn't know how it works or John Lennon didn't know how it works. And I'm like, dude, those people like Jimi Hendrix was in Little Richard's band for like years and years. And had to play every song under the sun with some of the best players ever. You think he didn't know what he was doing? Like that's a romanticized fable that keeps you kind of like flabby on what you should know, in my opinion. And there's probably players out there who really don't know anything, are just natural talents, sure. But like, I mean, the Beatles played in Germany before they got famous for their. I mean, this is like well publicized in Malcolm Gladwell's books about their 10,000 hours being spent learning every song in the public lexicon. And if you learn every song out there and perform it every night for 5 different sets, you're going to develop a worldview and an understanding of why these chords connect to each other. Now, maybe they didn't have all the words and the names for them right now, but
mhm.
you know, it's really interesting. Guitar is a community where there's so much pushback against knowledge and this assumption and this I think it's a falsehood that professional musicians don't know what they're doing. But
Mm.
do you hear that in singing?
That's a really good question. From what I've experienced, there there are a few schools of thought where these days I would say, like, if I could put like a Venn diagram, like, there's still classical, and classical has subsets, of course, but generally speaking, classical is very by the books. And that stems from, like, opera is everything is to a T in opera.
Yeah. It's the equivalent of giving a great speech that you memorized with
Yeah.
the right emotion. It's not improvisational in nature, right?
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, there's no room for it. From my teachers, like, you sing what's written.
Right.
Yeah. So that has, it's almost like the grandparent. It's still got power in, I would say it's still probably the predominant view. Then, of course, rock happened, and rock's been around for quite a while now. And so any kind of vocal and school of thought that's come from that has been, well, of course, more lax, especially with like metal and that sort of thing, where it's just like, you get the freaking sound, man. You get the sound, and if you're not hurting your throat, you're good. That's pretty much what like voice teachers and metal are on, in my view. And I agree with that, because if it's not hurting, then you're trying to get an ugly sound. I mean, there's no
Right.
real standard beyond that.
I always wondered about that because as someone who likes to sing but doesn't, I'm not known for being a singer, right?
Mhm.
Is in order to get that sound, you're kind of, are you faux yelling? Are you like approximating what yelling sounds like through some other vocal channel rather than actually yelling the way you would if something terrible happened?
That's a great question too. I would say sometimes both. Like, it depends on how a person yells. Because when I was a kid, I remember now, many times I would scream because I was upset, and I would lose my voice, and I'm like, why does that
Right.
happen? Whereas sometimes as an adult, like, I'm known for being loud. I'll be the first to admit.
Me too.
And and I can be obscenely loud to the point like I'm heard blocks away. No damage whatsoever. So it depends on how.
It's a technique. I guess what I'm saying is it's a technique, right? I mean,
Yes.
like, you're not just yelling the way you would yell naturally. You have to, I
Yeah.
don't know. And that's something I would love to learn, to be honest.
Hmm.
Like, it would be, in the guitar world, that's like adding overdrive to a guitar or like
Yeah.
fuzz to a guitar, right?
Oh, it's so much fun.
And I just never had that channel to my voice. I when I'm doing that, I instantly switch to head voice or falsetto.
Yeah. There's a couple of different ways. I mean, that I was going to say that is like, for me, in terms of interest, that's like the new frontier, because I mean, opera's been done for centuries. Broadway's been done. Belting, like, pretty much clean vocals. I think we've seen most of what can be done. But then when you get into anything distortion wise, it's like, well, we're still seeing new things happen to this day. And that
Yeah,
to me is so exciting.
yeah. I'm not like a heavy music fan generally. Like, the furthest I go towards really heavy is more of a prog metal, like Tool level, and I have a big, I really love like Maynard from Tool, for instance. Like, it's very melodic still, but it's also very textured, and he really walks the whole gamut of it. Right, he might be like grunting almost inaudibly, or not understandably, right?
Yeah.
And then he'll go right into this other side of his personality where he's just soaring, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
he is.
but if you listen to like a lot of heavy music now, I suddenly feel very old saying things like this, but I'm like, are those even words? Like, what? Like, what am I hearing right now? And there's a lot of. It's almost like the way the guitar community is with like the athleticism part. It's like
Hmm.
Stevie Ray Vaughan played 13 gauge, 14 gauge, 15 gauge strings that were like as rigid as like railroad metal, and if you're not doing that, you're not a real guitarist, kind of thing. And these are the guys that my friend Buddy Blues, who runs like a YouTube channel, he coined a phrase that he calls my buddy Steve, because the guitar community is very much about justifying the money you've already spent on your rig, and if that was wrong, then my life is a sham. And so they usually will say, "Oh yeah, I've heard of that. My buddy Steve has that, but he said he didn't like it that much." So everybody's constantly putting down everybody else's gear choices because it's not the choices you made. So it's
Yeah.
it's really funny. So
That's interesting.
I'm waiting for him to make T-shirts with my buddy Steve on them. But
That's amazing. I love that.
probably like that in the singing space. With what microphone are you using? Or
Oh
do
yeah.
you have a Neumann, or do you have like what preamps are you using on your stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't been too big into gear. I got the Shure and I got my PreSonus, and I'm like, man, it's good. All I
Yeah,
know is it's good. Plus, I don't have a soundproof room. I'm not gonna get a condenser mic.
you and me
So
both, brother.
yeah, yeah. It's just and the home studio. That's a blessing.
Oh yeah, I mean,
That's a blessing.
I think I had this like my dad got me a tube preamp in like the late '90s, and it probably sat in a box for years. And then one day I was like, I should try and record, because computers were kind of just getting to that point where maybe you could do that
Mm.
together. But I didn't have like an audio interface. I was trying to like run it into the microphone input on the side of a computer, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, there's been great albums recorded. Like look at Elliott Smith, right? I mean, like, so lo-fi and so much emotion and so many. Like, if he didn't do that, I know he eventually came to an unfortunate end. But if he didn't get those out, if he was waiting for the right gear to get those albums out, we would have never heard them potentially, right? So I think there's a lot to just starting, like, just even if it's not the perfect thing you're going to make, or you don't have the right gear, like and I'll say this, it's the same thing with my channel. Like, when I first started this channel, I didn't have 6 cameras to switch angles from, and I didn't have 4 microphones and a universal audio 4 input audio interface and all that stuff. I had iMovie, and I had my photography, because I've been a photographer for 25 years, and
Huh.
I would just use the Ken, what the Ken Burns effect is. It just slowly zooms in on whatever the subject is, or zooms out. So if you ever watch Ken Burns documentaries, a lot of the photography of like that age, they would use this effect called Ken Burns effect. So before I knew how to edit video, I would just play a bunch of audio and record it, have it sound good, but I didn't have a video to put the audio over. So I just took my photography and did a Ken Burns zoom in or zoom out on it and put that on Instagram. And that pretty much got my channel from roughly, 0 followers to 2,500 followers. And that only at that point did I actually have video cameras and video editing actually happening. So, it's, if I didn't do that though, who knows where I'd be right now. I'd probably be back at square one, still waiting for the right gear to enter my life. Right. So
Yeah. That's
just
that's
start.
really good advice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Because you generally speaking, we want something done, but we want it done right. And there's a gap between ability and reality, and dreams and reality, right?
Yep.
And actually, that's kind of what we're finding now. Well, that's a common theme in what I'm learning myself, and in the way that our training is developing here, where it used to be kind of the way that just people teach singing is just like, there are some fundamentals, but at some point there is a gap between what the instruction is and what the ability is. And realizing that, I was like, wait, we have to walk it back. In fact, we have to like break it down even further. So I didn't actually name voice break after that, but it kind of just fits in. So, but yeah, so we realized that if we can do the elementary stuff and make that the goal, then we can actually make progress, because oftentimes we're just asking ourselves to do something that's impossible with what we have.
Absolutely. Then there's also, are you and your instructor aligned on what your goals even are? It's the same thing as going to a guitar store and saying, hey, I want to buy an amp. What should I get? And then that person's worldview determines your path. And it's either going to be 100% right for you or something shy of that. But I think, like, there is a balance between the fundamentals, but also getting some return on investment in terms of the satisfaction from learning to sing a song end to end versus drilling scales, right?
Agreed.
Uh, and I think with guitar, I mean, it's probably like this with singing too, but I think that maybe guitar player listeners here can tell me I'm a liar or they can say you're right. We'll see. But like the typical path of a guitar player is learning cowboy chords, open position chords down here, right?
Mm.
And then once you learn those, you learn bar chords, which are the approximation of these chords. But instead of the nut, you slide up and you create the nut with your finger. And so these are
Uh-huh.
the next level of difficulty. And a lot of players never even get through that because the setup, by that I mean the string height and the playability of the guitar they have, who knows what they're working with. They might have got it from their aunt for Christmas. They might have
Yep.
bought it themselves, but it may not have been set up by a professional. So I should mention to anyone who plays guitar or is trying to play guitar in the singing community, please take your guitar, and maybe it's great, who knows, take it to a professional at a guitar shop you trust. I would not recommend Guitar Center. I would recommend an independently owned shop that does guitar repair. It'll probably cost you $70, and they could probably have it done in an hour if they're not too busy, just to set the string height, the intonation, to make sure every fret plays in tune as much as it can. And when you get it back, you're going to be like, man, I thought this guitar was a C minus at best, and now it's an A plus. So um, get that done. I don't have an analogy for what that would be in the singing world, but if you are struggling to play bar chords because the strings are too high, or if you're playing notes and there's buzzing or distracting noise, it's because the neck is not straight or the saddle's too low or too high. Once you get into it for a bunch of years, you can learn to change these things yourself. And that will save you not only the cost of paying a professional to do it, but you'll be able to set it exactly the way you want. But if you're just getting into guitar, do not burden yourself with that. Take it to a professional. And so anyway, you get past the bar chords, then you start learning scales, right? And so
Mhm.
guitarists tend to learn the blues scale, this one scale like this, that not everyone will see this video, but you're nodding your head. You probably have already heard the blues scale, I'm
Yeah.
sure. But and then guitarists kind of just stop learning. And depending upon if you have a family member who, like, it's very, like I said before, I take for granted that my dad taught me because it wasn't for an hour a week that I would get access to someone who knows stuff. I had him all day, every day to ask questions to. But a lot of folks, they never take lessons or they are self-taught, or these days they're consuming YouTube videos about like how to play this riff from this song. Okay, here's what the pentatonic scales are. Here's what the mixolydian mode is. And there's no lesson plan to progress in a linear nature. It's very all over the place. So
Mhm.
I would say, like, there's a lot you can do with just cowboy chords, bar chords, and the blues scale. But there's a lot of other scales out there. And I think the most important thing for me, I'll share with this group for people who are learning guitar. If I could restart everything at age 11, what would I have learned first with 30 years of experience? I would say I would obviously learn the chord shapes, but instead of just learning this shape, the E shape and the A shape, which corresponds to the open E and A shape on a guitar, I would learn on a guitar neck, there's this concept called CAGED, CAGED. And you can voice an E in an E shape, you can voice an E in a D shape, you can voice it all the way up the neck in 5 different shapes, and then it starts over. And what that does for you is it gives you the freedom to revoice your chords up the neck. So one inversion might be the root in the bass, the next one might be the third in the bass, the next one might be the fifth in the bass, or if you're playing more complicated chords like sevenths, the seventh could even be in the bass, for instance. So that's one huge part, is cage, because once you know all those shapes, it really frees you up to be able to say, okay, well, where are the scales? Because the scales are the chords. Like the scales are really a collection of notes that are made up of the chord tones plus some outside notes that are not in the chord tones. And they are all interlaced on top of every position of the caged shapes for an E chord. So now you have the whole neck to play not only the voicing of E with the inversion that you want, but you always have familiar notes under your fingers to play major pentatonic scales, minor pentatonic scales, or blend those scales together, which is really where I live. It's major with a hint of minor, a hint of mixolydian, and once you know all those positions and those major and minor pentatonic scales, you can start bringing in the outside notes that correlate to a mode. So there's this perception when you start guitar that, oh yeah, you probably learned pentatonic, and there's a joke about pentatonic that a lot of guitarists just never learn anything after that. And it's true. Like you can make a lot of money with minor and major pentatonic. But one thing that really changed the game for me was understanding that when you learn a song and it's an A major and it goes A, F sharp minor, D, E, I spent years and years accompanying my dad or jamming with other people, and I thought that I had to fit the A major pentatonic scale over that whole progression because it's an A major. And what you really want to do is take everything I just said, find the nearest chord voicings, and change scales for every chord as it approaches in a progression. And like that's what singers do, right? You don't just sing the A major pentatonic scale over everything. When you hit F sharp minor, you got to be locking in on F sharp, C sharp, and A. When the D chord comes around, you got to make sure to sing D, F sharp, A. And you can bring in outside tones for dissonance and resolve them. But that was a game changer for me, and I learned that embarrassingly late. So I'm telling people here now, if you're that guitar player, either coming from a singing angle or not, try and really push yourself when you learn a song or you're improvising to a progression. Change scales as you play. If it's a major, play A major pentatonic. If it's F sharp minor, play F sharp minor pentatonic. D major pentatonic, etc. And you will instantly start sounding like you are inside, as opposed to trying to fight your way in from the outside, which is how I always used to feel. So that was hugely valuable to me. And the last thing I'll mention is Nashville numbers. So have you ever heard of Nashville numbers or the number system?
Especially recently.
Yeah, awesome. So like it really comes in handy if you're trying to learn a song and you can see everything in terms of variables rather than just the chord names. If you ever had that moment where you're like, wait, I know like a lot of songs in A minor, and some of them have a D major in them, and others have a D minor in them. What's that about? And what it really comes down to is, well, what is the root key? Is this song in C major or is it in G major, for instance? Because A minor lives in both. And so there's a part of that is the modes, etc. But there's a system that uses Roman numerals to say, don't think of that as an A minor. Think of that as the 6. Or think of it as the 3. And based upon that, the root chord is different. So can't really get into it non-visually in a format like a podcast, but that solved a lot of ambiguity for me when you're improvising with people and you see them playing a B minor and then there's a D and you're like, okay, B minor and D, those are both in the key of G. And then they play an A major and you're like, A major is not in the key of G. So now you're like, well, D must have been the 1. So it helps you to ground what key you're actually in, because then when they nod to you to take a lead, you need to know where you are. I think for singers it's a little different because you feel where you are a little bit more. Yeah. Guitar players, not everybody got into guitar playing having an inherent sense of tone or ear. And for me, I certainly didn't. I had to develop the ability to hear relationships and intervals between chords and notes that would, and it sounds impossible when you first start. You're like, how can I actually hear what's happening? And I don't know if you've had this journey too, but being able to finally, and for me, it was drilling and learning hundreds of songs. And once you do that, you go, oh, that's a minor 4 change back to a 1, then the 5. And if you didn't have Nashville numbers to represent those relationships, you're like, that's a D minor to an A to an E. But you wouldn't have a way to change the key and say, well, that's the same thing as a C minor to a G to a D, for instance. So it really helps to understand that stuff, I've found. So those are the big things. I would say the CAGED system, there's plenty of YouTube videos on that. Learn that. The major and minor pentatonic scales, switching major and minor pentatonic scales based upon the chord that's approaching, and then understanding the tapestry of the Roman numerals, that is Nashville numbers, about how songs are written and why they are written that way. And again, the guitar community sometimes will be like, well, I don't want to know how songs are written. I want to write my own songs, and I don't want to be walled in by what other people have done. Well, it's like, you kind of have to know the rules to effectively break them, is the way I would come at that
Yeah,
world. So
absolutely. It helps to have something defined where
yeah.
if you're starting from like you want to make your own thing, you I don't know if you've experienced this, but this has been a lesson that I keep learning myself.
Hmm.
When you go to create something from that mindset, you're like, I don't want to be caged in, right? You might be thinking that you're going to create something out of nothing, but there's no such thing.
So, and even if there was, everything's been done. The question is, how are you going to do it? And the perception of originality from your vantage point is actually irrelevant, because the people you're writing it for are listeners other than yourself, and they come from a vast history of what they've listened to. And if you are unintentionally doing something someone else has done, and you're not aware of it because you don't want to learn, you're still unoriginal. You're just unaware that you're unoriginal, right? Like, because not everybody, that change in vantage point from the creator to the listener, like, I think some of the best producers and artists out there are the ones who can put themselves in the shoes of the listener during the creative act. It's very hard to do, right? Because when I play a lick, I go, oh, that's the same lick I heard in this song, I'm totally unoriginal, blah blah blah. But not everybody out there has the same vantage point or the same journey of music influences that you do. So, you know, I think we can like, there's a saying that says great artists steal. I think steal is probably a pejorative term in this case, but when you borrow from other music, assuming that you're not just directly sampling it, of course, like,
Mhm.
it's going to come out of you. Let's assume that at best you're going to be a B+ student of your influences. Well, guess what? That gap between A+ and B+ is the how you're going to sound different or original.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, Plus, hopefully, you're not just listening to Stevie Ray Vaughan all day. You're probably listening to Pink Floyd. You're probably listening to Radiohead. You're probably listening to Hendrix, and some amalgamation of those influences is going to be the way you sound. Um, so, be a B+ student of your influences and meld them together. Yeah.
That's a really good way to put that.
Well,
That's a
thank you.
really good way to put that. So, yeah, I was hoping that you would share some of that kind of insight because first of all, I didn't know you were a teacher. First
Well,
and foremost.
I moonlight in it. I spend a lot of time typing a lot on DMs to people who want to know how I do what I do. And so I do lessons,
Yeah.
but usually virtual. And there's a world where I'm like, maybe I should start doing that on more seriously, right? But I'm up against the time constraints of a career and kids and this channel, and I really can't diversify without giving something else up on the channel, right? So
Mhm.
I do love it though. It's something I naturally get energy from, and it's something that you can probably tell from how much I'm talking right now that it's something that I lose track of time talking about. And I think when you lose track of time doing something, that is kind of the universe telling you you're on the right wavelength. So
Yeah.
always been something there with that. So we'll see what it becomes. But
In
yeah,
time. In time. Yeah. That's great advice, and I appreciate actually that you're talking about a linear progression. Then you also painted the linear progression in a structured sense. So for guitarists watching this, that will light some bulbs for sure.
sure. And I mean, I'm still on my journey. I'm not telling you from the mountaintop the way it needs to be, right?
Yeah.
I just added diminished chords to my vocabulary a while ago, and I mean, I knew what they were before, but I hadn't weaponized them into something that I could actually call upon
Mm.
strategically. Same thing with augmented chords. These are moments that are complex transitions that sound a little more rich than just hitting the 5 of a given key to get back to 1.
Mhm.
So I'm constantly looking for other ways to weave sounds in, but the only way I get on those tangents is through listening to music and learning those songs and going, well, how are they using that? Like, why is that there? And then taking a song apart and putting it back together and figuring it
Hmm.
out. So
Yeah, actually, that brings up a few different points that are extremely useful to know in terms of progression. Because a lot of times we come into music thinking like, how do I get it to sound good? What we need to do is understand how to make it work, because it's really about function. Like you're talking about with the Nashville numbers system, it's how do these things work in relation to each other?
yeah, and you could. I mean, it might be as simple as like, I like this song, and well, here's an example. So I don't know, not everybody's the same, but I've heard a lot, and it's a trope that when you like music, it makes your hair stand up. Or another way of saying that is it gives you goosebumps or the chills.
Mhm.
I'm a firm believer that if you're listening to music and it's giving you the chills over and over again, that is a signal that you should go learn that song. Like, and you should go not just learn it, but figure out what it is that's doing that. And so for me, I, I mentioned I learned like when I was 29, I'm 42 almost now. When I was 29, I had a breakthrough because I was like, my dad always had a songbook that he can call upon and sing unaccompanied with a guitar and just his voice. And so I was like, I'm going to make my own songbook, and I'm going to go old school and get a binder with like plastic sheets I can slip paper into, you know? And so I learned like all these songs by like Andrew Bird and Spoon and the Dodos, and all, it was kind of the indie scene around like 2005 onward that I was learning a lot of songs from. And but of course going backwards to the 60s too.
Hmm.
And the way I chose songs was they have those moments in them that make me go like they give me like the chills, right? And so because I was taking them apart and I was learning Nashville numbers at the same time to kind of think of songs as like algebraic combinations and not as an execution within a given key, using Roman numerals to represent a chord relationship rather than the actual chord names. I realized that every time a song goes to a minor four chord, it gave me that feeling. And I don't. The best way to think of that chord relationship is probably everyone knows "Creep" by Radiohead. The
Hmm.
fourth chord in every bar is a minor four chord in that song. Um,
Hmm.
Another way to think of it is "In My Life" by the Beatles. When he goes "In My Life," that part that is a minor four chord underneath there. So it's a rule breaking chord borrowed from a parallel key. So if you're singing in A major, it's the D minor that correlates to that change, that minor four chord is borrowed from A minor. And so it's there was also a bunch of other changes. And the way I'll correlate and explain it is when you map out a key, say C major, and C major is made up of C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and then B half diminished. All the songs that all the chords that naturally appear in C major as minor, which is what the ear expects because of the Western style of music, or as
Hmm.
major, if you invert them and flip them to minor where you expect major, or major where you expect minor, that explained nearly every single song that ever gave me chills. And which is that wild? So like
Yeah.
you should debug what it is that inspires you about music is the advice I would give. Like, so in a song in C major, if I heard it instead of A minor, I heard A major. That's an example of a capital six or a major six when you expect a minor six. If I heard a F minor instead of F major, that's the minor four change I was talking about. And once you have decoded all these moves, I mean, if I got into a band now, I used to feel when I was younger that we're writing a verse and then we need a chorus and go like, where should this chorus even go? Like, what are my options? What if I write something that doesn't even sound like it's part of the same song? The Nashville Numbers roadmap will really help you winnow down the possibilities into widely understood tropes of what a chorus can do for the
Hmm.
Beatles, for the Stones, for Radiohead, for whoever. And it doesn't mean you have to take those routes, but you might take the same route and then flip a minor chord to a major chord so it's different, right? Um, so anyway, very hard to explain without visuals. I'm doing a little bit of Italian hand storytelling right now. A lot of hand motions, but um, I'm not saying go out and learn to read music, because I am not a believer in key signatures and enharmonic names for D flat versus C sharp and learning to read music in a classical sense. I am a tablature reader. I am a player who plays by ear and by feeling, but underneath the ear and the feeling is years of taking songs apart, putting them back together, understanding them from a Roman numeral perspective, and basically chasing thirds all around the guitar to play chord tones for every approaching chord using minor and major pentatonic scales. That's the fastest way I can say what my approach is. And so it won't happen overnight, and some people might find other techniques work better for them, but this is what has led me to be able to make gear demos for the newest fuzz pedal or this new amp that Benson Amps is putting out or whatever. And I can play for 35 minutes with only minor fuck ups usually, and improvise to my heart's content. And I don't need a guitarist to play underneath me for rhythm. By playing the chord tones of what chords I'm visualizing in my head, you as the listener will hear me go from G major to B7 to C minor, for instance. And that has been the most gratifying change in my ability to play music. And it all comes from the things I mentioned earlier. So,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's actually very good insight for people who weren't trained classically, and actually increasingly more of us aren't,
Right.
in terms of reading, sight reading. Because if you're, let's say you're already an adult, you're in your 20s, 30s plus, which of the two do you have more experience with? You know Roman numerals, like people still use that.
Right.
You know numbers, you use math. That's not like something you have to, a language you have to learn, whereas
Yeah.
sight reading in
Music
classical,
notation, man. I
yeah,
have the hardest time learning it. And I agree totally. It's very
yeah.
unfamiliar, and the key, you get lost in key signatures and enharmonic note names. And it's very rare that I call an F sharp. Sorry, it's very rare that I call um, an F sharp a G flat, for instance. Like when it comes to the war of those two names, I just chose F sharp. Like I don't care what the fucking key is. I'm sorry. And I'm not gonna say D flat. I'm probably gonna say C sharp. But
Yeah.
if someone says D flat to me, it's not like I don't know what it is. I just have chosen a side in how to talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny that way. But
Yeah.
you see this stuff in a comment thread on Threads. I've gotten into fiery debates with music majors about
Oh
this.
man.
And I'm like, dude, you know what? Like when you're playing with a band or in a group, if you correct someone and say, actually, it's not a D flat, it's a C sharp, like, I don't know if you're going to get invited next week. Like, you know?
That's a perfect picture of like how, in all honesty, the learning of any music major is good. It's sound knowledge.
Yeah.
It helps. But in what sense will it help? Because if you're in a band, what's practical? Everyone reads tablature
Right.
nowadays, and it's not like that thing is going to be the cornerstone to your success as a player.
Yeah. I mean, again, it does come down to your goals. Like if you're trying to be a session player and the kind of music you are asked to contribute to is already written by a composer and you can't read, that's going to be a problem, right? But that's very much not what I'm doing. And it's very much not what 99% of people are out there doing. Like that's the kind of teaching that I object to in music. It's like, well, I'm going to teach you how to do all this stuff that doesn't really come in handy for what your goals are first, just so we can say we did it. And then we'll finally get to a place where you learn a song that you like, and it's like, man, you got to start people off by learning what they care about so that they get that endorphin rush from, oh my God, I can play these 4 chords. That means I can kind of sing this song now. And then worry about why it works once they get their feet under them. Right. I think why and how is very important, but it's very much a, I know 20 songs conversation, not your first one where you're just trying to figure out how to place your fingers,
Yep.
chords. So there's a time and a place for everything, but I think for, I won't tell anyone that learning how to sight read in music school is like the wrong move for them. But
Yep.
if you're a hobbyist or someone who wants to play with other people, I don't think it's the first step, personally.
I think that's absolutely fair. And I'm glad that you also stand for the goals of the individual, because I read that actually a couple years ago. I was teaching at School of Rock, and in between lessons I would read psychology and stuff, and so Google suggested I read this thing from Psychology Today about adult learning, which involves, well, it involves a person's goals, and as a teacher you have to construct your lesson around that. That was groundbreaking for me, because I always kind of believed that from my own experience going into college for music. I was like, and I only want to know some of this stuff, so can we like skip that?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's groundbreaking. And when you actually provide that content in terms of a lesson, like, hey, we're going to be learning what you want to learn. Isn't that great? And they're like, awesome. So by the end of it, they start playing it, they're singing it, they're doing what they want to do. Now they're motivated.
Yeah.
And motivation is an underutilized part of learning and education. Part of why I started my own business doing it.
Yeah. Oh, well said. Not everyone is a why does it work or a how does it work person. And, I think there's a lot of people out there with music that they don't even realize that's a question they can ask. They're just really enjoying the art side of learning guitar, and they just want to learn songs. But I feel like when you turn the corner from learning other people's songs to then wanting to bottle that magic and make your own songs, it helps to know why someone might have made the choices they did. But then again, there's probably a lot of people who are like, no, I don't want to know that. But
Yep.
and I'm not sitting on top of 6 albums of my own releases, and I'm not someone who releases my own music. I'm very much more of an improviser. So maybe don't listen to what I'm saying. If that's the case. Maybe those aren't your goals, right? But
Yeah.
all we can know is our own journey and the way we've come through it. So
Absolutely. One of my new students is going into the new training. Well, I actually offered him to do a free trial, and he's got an amazing voice, great vocals. And I was like, I appreciate you being open, even this far into your journey, to something new. And he's like, even if it wasn't really for me, I would still at least give it a try. He said, when you realize life is much more like a supermarket than we think, because you grab what you like and you leave what you don't.
Yeah, and not everybody starts with a teacher who says, let's learn the fundamentals first. And I know we were just debating around what even is a fundamental in terms of music reading versus practical satisfaction of learning a song. But everyone's journey is so custom tailored to whatever their limitations or their budget or their experience was, that sometimes people never had that moment to learn the fundamentals, or they have these gaps. And when you talk to musicians, it's easy to assume that easy to assume that we're all the same and we all had the same journey, but we did not. And that's a very diverse thing too, which is great, right? Because I think learning from other people from their journey is like really valuable too. But yeah, it's very
expanding. Expanding the worldview you have to show that, like, this has been your experience, and someone else's experience of the same thing can enlighten you on how there are nuances that you hadn't appreciated before. Like you're talking with the national number system, I actually got into that more especially last year, because like I was like, this is like the only thing that makes sense to me right now. Like I did some sight reading training when I was in college.
Yeah,
That only lasted for a year, and man, it was such a struggle. I'm like,
it's
why don't
tough.
I just not struggle?
Yeah, that's both sight reading and uh, interval recognition, like blind interval recognition. Two notes, how far apart are they? And you might know it from a C to a higher F, but then you hear a low F to a C, and you're like, I have no idea what that is. Like, because the inversions change your understanding. But
Yeah.
it's super gratifying. I'm not a person with perfect pitch, and very few people are, but I will tell people that like you can learn relative pitch just by learning other people's songs because it's like learning a new word. Like suddenly you're going to start seeing that word everywhere. So like I said earlier, like that minor four change that gave me chills every time I heard it. Now that is tattooed in my brain when I hear a new song and someone goes to a minor four chord or its major brethren, the flat six of a given key. I'm
Mm.
instantly like, oh yeah, they went to the flat six. I don't know what key it's in because I don't have perfect pitch. But if you give
Mhm.
me a guitar and I can quickly find the root note of wherever the key is, I'll be like, oh, it's an E flat major seven or something, or it's a C minor seventh or something.
Mm.
So like now imagine yourself in a band context and people are improvising and you can hear when someone goes from the one chord to a four chord and you can hear when someone goes to a five chord. Like this is not going to happen with the first song you learn. It is going to happen with like the 25th song you learn though, especially if you do it deeply enough but in rapid succession for your brain to grow into it. And to me that's like so fun because some of the moments I play the best guitar are with my eyes closed just listening and you're connecting the muscle memory of where the five chord scale shapes and the caged pattern that you're supposedly in. And I hear that hallmark major third of the five chord and I go, oh, they're going to the five. I'm going, or then they go down to the four and you're like, okay, I know where this is. And they're probably going to the one next because that's what songs do. Like there are these well-worn paths in songs and people look at it and they go, man, there's 12 major chords and there's 12 minor chords. There's 24 different possibilities of any. If I'm going to sit down and figure out a song blind, no YouTube, no Harmony Central, no Ultimate Guitar tabs, that's a lot of variables, like 24 different variables for every chord change. Well, guess what? There's really not that many possibilities. If you look at popular music and actually sounding good within the lexicon of what the ear expects, there's about five other chords you could hit from any chord that you're coming from without breaking the Nashville numbers rules. Now, people will push back on the word rules. I'm using that in a loose sense. And when I say rules, I mean expectations. Like, this is what the ear expects. Now, there are ways to break those expectations, but
Mhm.
generally speaking, any change within a given key, talk about reducing your probability from 23 other options to five other options is a huge advantage when you're
Mhm.
playing with other people. Um, and trying to hear what they're playing, or if you're playing with a recording, like if I'm figuring out a song, it very quickly becomes clear to me that like, oh, this is an E Ionian because I hear this is an E major chord. They're obviously going to the six next, then the four, then the five. I'm betting that the bridge of the song is probably going to go to the two or the three, resolve through the five to the one. And it's like everything I'm saying right now is there's going to be some listeners who are like, what the shit are you talking about? But I guarantee you, learn 20 songs with a guitar, with a piano, whatever your with your voice. I mean, but you kind of want a multi-timbral instrument and an instrument that's capable of chords, at least, to play
Mhm.
with. And by the time you learn 20 songs and write down what they're doing, you're going to see patterns. You may not see patterns in a Roman numeral sense that can be applied to any key, but within C, you're going to quickly notice that most C songs have an A minor, an F, and a G. They just do. So,
Mhm.
um, yeah, that's the advice I would give: is just follow what gives you goosebumps, what makes your hair stand up. Learn those songs, and there is a certain level of don't learn insanely hard songs first, even if they do make your hair stand up. Find ones that you can strum first, right?
Yeah, makes absolute sense. That's the idea again of we want to shoot to the finish line, but it's just not where we are.
Sure. And like that can be more of an aspirational goal.
Hmm.
No matter how fancy a song is or how fast the lead playing or flashy it is, there's always chords that would go under that lead playing or singing, right?
Hmm.
So then if the song is too hard for you, go learn what the implied chords would be. And then that you can play along with it and practice your rhythm guitar playing, you know. So
Yeah, that's actually brilliant. Defining kind of caging up the overwhelm of like, oh my god, there's so much to learn, just this little amount. And once you do, you'll see what you need to move on to the next step.
yeah, no matter how fancy or flashy the playing is, it sounds good to us because the notes that they're playing come from the chords. So even in instrumental playing, like I play a lot of unaccompanied guitar playing on my YouTube channel, but there's totally implied chords happening underneath. It's because I'm targeting the chord tones of a B7, B, F sharp, E flat, and A, for instance. And that's the
Hmm.
five chord that's going to lead me back to E major or E minor, etc. So um, I think a lot of people don't realize that. I think when they're just starting out, they're like, "Oh, I just like this. Like, how do I write a riff for a song?" It's like, well, start with the notes that are in the chords that you're writing for, and then you can bring in outside notes to give it a modal flavor or some characteristics of tension before you resolve it back to consonants. But it was always a mystery. Like riff writing was always a mystery to me. It was like people just put these magic combinations of notes together and they sound great. It's like, well, typically it's coming from the chord tones with some esoteric choices in terms of outside notes to pull the ear in.
Hmm.
And then a
Yeah.
lot of times riffs, they occur over several chords. Like they don't just play over a static G chord. Maybe the progression is G, E minor, C, D. Well, over the E minor, guess what? They're bringing in E, B, and E, G, B, and D. Over the C, they're bringing in C, E, G, and over the D, they're bringing in D, F sharp, A. Like, and that's what makes it sound like it fits on those chords. So
Uh-huh.
you can't, everything I just rattled off. You're not going to know it till you know the fretboard, or until your voice knows the fretboard, and you map those things together. But
Right.
it's certainly. I think there's a lot of people who think it takes the mystery out of music, but to me, there's so much more mystery left. At, having a flashlight in a cave does not mean you can see every detail.
That's a good way to put it. I actually find that recently I realized improv is fun. Like I'm coming back to more things that I find fun because for much of this journey for me, it's been like do it by force and do a lot of work for what I don't even really know. So I'm like, why don't I just enjoy something? And I find that improv is enjoyable to me. And then I realized that that's lightning in a bottle. But what makes the improv is it's always based on something. Like even if it's not music, it's the yes and idea. But what are
Yeah,
you saying yes and to?
yeah, yeah. Yes, and is powerful. There's also people who will suggest things that really don't work sometimes too. So it's also knowing when to call it quits on a yes and that it's
I
not
see.
working. But I'm also
That's true.
not an improv troupe person. But improvisationally, for instance, like the school of thought that I don't need to know what I'm doing because music is spiritual and I can improv my way through things. Well, guess what? You're going to sound like you don't know what you're doing if the rhythm guitar is playing a dominant A7th chord and you start playing A major 7th arpeggios. Like, I can't imagine a worse sound than that. Or if someone's playing a C minor chord and you start playing C major or C dominant over it. Like, but interestingly, you can play minor scales over major chords because that's actually what rock and roll is with some minor adjustments of rolling from the minor third into the major third and melding
Hmm.
those scales together. But yeah, it's there's all these cultural rules, and unless you play with other people, you may not even understand these contracts we all sign with each other that of what sounds good and what doesn't from a general assumption level. But when you play with folks who are strictly yes and, but they don't understand some of these conventions, it can be really hard for everyone to move past them because we can't all speak with the same lexicon of what's going on.
Yeah, that's true. Having having like total freedom is actually a burden because of how much choice there is.
Right. I think that's right.
Yeah. And it was something that I kind of said to myself recently that kind of made me let loose about some things was like following a framework but discovering the details. That's what's fun about life and music and improv and maybe even the whole creative process. It's just like, you know, people don't want to follow script, people don't want to learn theory,
Hmm.
but
Well, how exhausting is it when you learn a new guitar lick or a singing hook and you go, God, I love that. Like, why does that work over where I used it? And then you get to your next practice and you're writing a bunch of original music or you're doing covers and you're like, man, I should use that hook right here, and then it doesn't work. Like, well, why does it work over that versus this? And that's the part that a lot of players they don't get through that part. It's just a mystery to them. And it's like chalk it
mm,
up to nature or spirituality, who knows what. But like it to me, that's frustrating. Like to me, I if I learn something new that I really love that makes my hair stand up, I want to know when I can channel that, bring it in, and weaponize it to my benefit, right? And so
hmm,
it's kind of like the example I just said of like if you're playing an A major seventh and then I start playing A dominant, it's gonna be like, oh God, this band really does not have it together, right? Um, so yeah.
yeah. That's a good bit of insight. I actually hadn't thought of it like that in a musical sense. In the in the development of the way we train, the way we've been training recently, I came to that realization as well. Like we we don't want a one size fits all, just one little thing for everything, but we do want to say, okay, this works here and that works there. So when do these things work?
Yeah, and maybe your way of borrowing from your influences, but not copying them directly, is by taking a lick that you love or a singing phrase that you love, but singing it in a different context, but it does work. Like that's an example of not directly sampling, but stealing like an artist or borrowing in an influences kind of way. But it's not going to work over everything. There is a
Hmm.
reason why it's going to work or it's not going to work. Um,
Hmm.
and
And then,
but maybe it's just me being intimidated by singing is a very blind trait. Like I always have the visual anchor of where I am on a guitar, and that's
mhm.
what one reason I'm not a singer still, really, because it's like having no visual cue of even where I am or where the band is. If
Mhm.
they're a little bit sharp or a little bit flat, and you have to be with them on that, that's terrifying to me. But it's
It
fascinating too, right?
yeah.
I dream of being able to do that, and so
I appreciate you mentioning that because that's something that we all probably think about at some point, and it is fucking terrifying because
it
you,
is.
especially coming into it as a novice, you're like, well, okay, so I'm getting these fundamentals down, and then I have to perform live, and there's this demand on you, like you got to have your part, but where do you get it from? I
Yeah.
my teacher, and this is partly actually it's both, so rhythm and pitch, but there was to me it was like a horror story, but he was like he told me about this this role that he had to play where he had to count like he was the rhythm and he was the
Ooh.
next entrance
Ooh.
and had to have the right note.
So is this like a situation where the band you start the song on a company, then the band comes in kind of vibe, or what was it?
Well, it was an opera.
Oh, well, sure. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was
I would
just like,
expect that those people, it's funny, like it's very psychological, right? So if you told me to sing an A note right now,
mhm,
that would be intimidating to me, and I would probably come in sharp or flat or on a completely different note. But if you
mhm,
said sing the first note in Airbag by Radiohead,
mhm,
I could sing it no problem because it's imprinted on my brain all these years of hearing it so often.
yeah,
But I know it's an A note. I know the song's an A, and but there's something about being a singer where you need to collapse everything I just said into an instinctual knowledge of what an A note is. And maybe some people have a pitched pipe or a cue from a keyboard when they're going to do something unaccompanied before the band comes in. They need a little bit of help to make sure they don't start in G sharp and then the band comes in and you're suddenly in A, which would be my deepest nightmare.
yeah,
Um, but the other thing that drives me nuts is like, imagine you learned to sing that song Airbag in A your whole life, and then somehow the band starts playing in G sharp, and now you're outside of the well-worn path through the forest in the key of A, and you have to work strictly with intervals. Like it's easy to get dragged back into the well-worn path, I would imagine.
absolutely.
I mean, does that ever happen to you where you have to change the key? You're used to singing "Oh Darling" in the key of A by the Beatles, and then someone's like, "Well, we're gonna do it in B." You're like, "Are we though?" Like, I
Yeah, that's a
do you
scary
even think
moment.
about that, or am I just paranoid from the outside thinking about singing?
No, I mean, I've thought about that a trillion times, even beyond like, okay, my time in school is when I was really performing. Anytime that I had to think about like you have to be on this pitch, it's like in this key, because at the time I was like trying to listen for reference to someone else singing. Like I don't know anything.
And hopefully they
So
know what they're doing, right? Because they can drag
right,
you off key too. They don't know.
right. So that it's just a nightmare. It's just a nightmare. But in the way that you're describing guitar in like Nashville numbers and that sort of thing, there is there is a foundation.
Mhm.
So it's actually like what my teacher described was the way that he did it was he had the A, and let's say it was an A because I don't remember what it was
Yeah.
from the previous act, and he had to keep it in head.
And then everyone's trying to talk to you before your set, and you're like, I can't talk right now. I'm trying to keep an A in my head.
Yeah. Well, actually, he's like alone on the stage, I believe.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And
feel like
hopefully this isn't the first time you're doing it. There is
yeah.
somewhat of a well-worn path that I've practiced this part so many times that hopefully I couldn't sing an A wrong if I tried because it's just
Right.
the muscle memory of hitting that, right?
Exactly. And I think when you're a beginner or when you have I mean maybe some experience but not quite that much experience
Yeah.
and you feel like these are the stories that you hear, you're like that's the expectation. Like how the hell am I going to do that? Right?
Yeah. Well, you're not going to
So,
do it tomorrow, right?
no.
There's a lot of steps to get there, but it is
Exactly.
one of those things that'll keep you up at night, or it'll be a fever dream going, now I got to lead this whole musical and I don't even know the notes. Or,
Mhm. Yeah, and there's many things to life like that. I would say that's when if it's really your thing, like you want to do this,
Mhm.
but it's still terrifying to you, then you've got to get cracking and you've got to make some sacrifices because you're doing it for your own sake of comfort. Like you want to
Yeah,
feel safe.
yeah.
And so you have to maybe even wear multiple hats like we do as creators, where maybe you don't know piano quite well, but now you've got to learn, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was a time where I had to, you know, really practice talking into a camera. And if you put me on a live stream like I am right now, and I don't have to say the stats of how many ohms these pickups are and what kind of magnets they are and all that memorization, like I can obviously, you're probably like, yeah, you're talking too much, but I don't have problems talking extemporaneously.
Yeah.
But the moment you put me in front of a camera and I have to get product specs right, or it's not live, without the pressure of being live, I fuck up a lot. And I'll end up, which if you watch my monologues on my channel, there'll be little micro snips and cuts where I keep the good parts of my monologue. Because a long time ago, I decided that it is not worth me trying to nail the monologue in one cut. That is not why people are watching this channel. They are watching to see me play for 20 minutes without fucking up 100 times, though. And I am proud of the fact of how little I fuck up while improvising.
Yeah.
But talking takes a while to like really get right. And so I think what I'm getting at is that there's a learning curve to everything, and you're not going to nail it the first day out, but you just got to find a rhythm and a way of attacking it that works for you. You know, I am not a player that is like, here's an entire Slash solo from a Guns N' Roses song. Like I don't play that way. I don't go out and learn solos note for note. I have done that, but it's not where I live. That's not my wheelhouse. I instead like to take these flashpoints in solos that I'm like, that's a cool moment. What are they doing there? And then take it apart, and then I'll put it back together, but my own way. And now I know anytime a minor 4 chord happens, I can use that idea in the right context. So talking to a camera is similar. It's like I know that I'm not going to be the guy who's going to nail the entire thing in one take, and that's okay. This isn't even my real like. This isn't even what I do for a living. This is just for fun. So I've had to forgive myself of that. You know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the weight of the expectation of like, well, perfection is just too big. Always striving for growth. That's good.
Yeah.
And there's degrees to everything too. Like
being a little scared of what comes next is healthy. Otherwise, you're not growing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's important too.
Yeah, I would say. Well, one, I relate to you as well. I actually did not imagine that I would ever be doing this personally. Like last year, if you told me I was going to be doing a podcast, I'd be like, dude, I don't like seeing myself on camera. First of all,
you got to get over it, though. It's so hard at first. Totally.
Yeah, it is. And I did too. I practiced like smiling on camera because I had to do headshots and stuff like that. And it was like, it was humiliating at first.
Yeah.
You're doing this thing that you're like, I don't ever want to be doing that. But you know that you have to because it's what you're committed to.
Yeah.
So I would say one thing that I did wrong personally, that if I could start over again, I would do completely different, would be to not throw myself into the lion's den without any preparation, thinking that just pure exposure therapy is going to solve everything. Yeah. It's going to make things exponentially worse because you're going unarmed in the lion's den. You're going straight where you're most afraid, but you're giving yourself no backup.
And singing is one of those things that really is, at least for me, if you start on the wrong note or come in tepid or timid, I should say, not tepid, it's very hard to recover because now you're in your head thinking about what just happened instead of thinking about what's coming, right?
Yep.
And that in itself is an art, to like forgive yourself the moment and realize that probably no one else even knows what just happened. So why hold yourself accountable for that? Like, just the more you can look forward and make sure, because you don't want compounded mistakes either, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I would say to anyone starting out right now or who has struggled with that sort of thing, do it a little more gradually, and also bring like prepare some arsenal to what you're gonna do. Like, don't just be like expecting that by shoving yourself in there, somehow, someday, it's going to get better with no change in your
Yeah.
approach.
I'm a big fan of like simulating the environment you'll be performing in. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to be singing through a PA at an open mic, but you've never sang through a PA before,
Mm-hmm.
like maybe find out what kind of microphone they have there, find out what kind of PA cabinets they have. I'm not saying go buy the same ones, but I'm saying if you don't own any PA cabinets or a microphone and you call yourself a singer, you should probably go look into that, because you don't want to be shocked by what the microphone dynamics are once you're in a room, because the room is always going to be different. It just is. And an empty room is different than a filled room with people absorbing all the sound instead of the reflective surfaces, right? If
Yeah.
you've never sang with in-ears on, like versus just in the natural, if you're playing with a drummer and you're trying to hear your own monitored signal and you have a cymbal in your ear, like being tone deaf in a singing context is like the scariest thing possible, I think. And you even saw,
Yeah.
I think Mariah Carey even went through that at like New Year's Eve one year, where she's like, I can't even hear myself. And oh my god, it's so hard. I mean, I think these days, here's is an anecdote. So like when I play demos, I it's not in frame. Actually, it is in frame. These microphones right here,
Mm-hmm.
they're right in front of a cabinet, a guitar cabinet with two 12-inch speakers in them, and they're super loud. And so normally when you record things, like it's not like, it's so funny. Like when I meet people and they're like, "Oh, I'm a fan of the channel." I'm like, "Oh, thanks a lot." They're like, "I love what you guys do," and I go, "That thanks. That means so much to us." And it's like, it's not us, it's me. Like I'm the only person working on all this, and like that's kind of a compliment, right? They think it's a whole level of execution that an organization would drive, not one individual.
Yeah.
But when I'm setting up mics, though, and I'm in the room with a cabinet and it's super loud, like I don't have an engineer to say over the intercom, "Hey, move the mic because the phase is wrong. These two mics are not working together. They're fighting each other. So move it forward, backward, left, right, up, down, whatever." I have to do that myself, but I can't move it an inch and then record it and then listen to it and play back in headphones, because too much time has passed and I've forgotten what the previous thing sounded like. So one thing I discovered was I actually bought in-ear monitors and started putting them in while I'm moving the mics around. And it offers enough isolation from the giant 212 cabinet that's right next to me that I can hear phase relationships. And when you're doing four microphones, you kind of want to set the one mic up so it sounds good, then add the second one, mute the others, and then get those two in line. Do the third one and unmute it, get that one, do the fourth one, and then do that one. And then check phase on your interface to make sure you didn't just set up. If you flip phase and it sounds the same, guess what? You're exactly in the middle of being in phase or out of phase.
Uh,
When you flip phase, you want it to sound terrible when you flip phase. And that means that chances are you're completely or somewhat close to in. But that was a moment that I was like, I never thought I would own a pair of in-ears, because I don't play in a group that does that, and I don't really sing professionally. But I
mm,
found a use case for in-ears within my own like very specific guitar demo setup, and so that was really helpful. Sometimes I even put on over-ear cans over the in-ears for even more isolation from the cab that's right next to me, so I can hear the phase relationship. So um, yeah, it's really, really super interesting. But every week I learn, I mutate my process just a little bit more. I learn something else that I could do to make things 1% better. You know? So
yeah, the 1% is is a thing that I hear a lot more recently, probably from being online so much. Because actually, before I started this business, I actually had almost no social media. I like deleted everything after COVID, and I was like, for personal use, I found it toxic for myself. But dang, I think I lost the point.
that's almost, that's almost happened to me a few times too.
uh,
About in-ears, I was talking about
yeah,
being 1% better, and you were saying how you've seen
1%.
1% better around social.
Yes, run social media recently. And I find an interesting kind of a thought of like I guess it's an ego derivative thought is that 1% is too little. We got to shoot for more. But
Well, it depends. How often are you shipping a deliverable, right? If you make a new album every year and it's only 1% better, maybe that's not acceptable. But if you're committing to practicing 20 minutes a day iteratively and you're 1% better every day, that's a pretty good interval of improvement,
yeah,
I'd say. So,
absolutely.
yeah.
That's a good, actually a great picture of well, a few things that I've realized recently, just this past month, like the commitment, the time and the interval that you put in, that is the deciding factor. Because, well, of course, you want to have an analysis process, like what's working, what's not. But we have these goals, and oftentimes they're pretty big goals, like ambitions. And we think it's actually about achieving the goal, but it's actually about the commitment, which is the goal actually serves the commitment, if that makes sense.
So this is the journey is the goal, right? The goal
Yeah.
is important that it's ambitious enough, but the journey itself should be fulfilling on its own,
Right.
on the good days.
Hmm. Yeah. And so regarding the 1%, the just daily improvement, it is a realistic goal, and it is what's going to achieve the goals. But then along the way, you're going to find that you're just doing it to do it. So just keep going.
Yeah, I mean, you might start off with a 365-day goal and you're going to practice every single day to be 1% better every day towards that loftier goal. But you might get 200 days in and realize that your goals have changed, right? So
Hmm.
um, it's very individual. What can I say? It's
Totally.
and, you know, I think things tighten up as you get older too. Like you kind of
Mm.
rule. I'm like, I know I'm not going to be like a touring superstar guitarist at this point, and like I'm okay with that. It's more important to me to play every kind of guitar out there and learn how to swap the pickups and learn what I like about certain sounds and how to record them and push my theory behind my playing to level up my improvisation. But you know, I have kids, man. You know, I have a career. Like that, life kind of narrows your path over time. And I know that sounds scary for those of us out there who may be young or 20 or 18 years old or something, but it's not always a bad thing. Like
Yeah.
realizing that you have a specialty, you have a lane, is very clarifying in some ways.
Absolutely.
So otherwise, it can be very daunting when you're younger, I find.
That's true. That's true. I think probably we all experience that to some degree. And I can relate with the fear of like it getting narrower because there's some things that you have to give up. Like some
Yeah,
hopes, some dreams, and it's just like that's not really going to happen because now you're getting serious about what you do.
yeah. I mean, it's like there's a lot of people who make in my lane. There's a lot of people who make guitar demos that they're like, here's how this pedal sounds in a mix. So then they write a whole track and they play rhythm guitar, bass, lead guitar over the top, and it's very much a contextual reference point. And then the question for guitarists is like, okay, you're making a whole track. Who played drums? And you're like, oh, I hand programmed all the drums in Ableton Live on drum pads on my push controller. Or no, I just bought some drum loops from this vendor or whatever. And it's like you can't do everything. You like I have totally at peace now that you're not going to be watching my channel going, let me hear it in a mix. Like you're going to hear the mics mixed well, at least according to my preferences, but you're not going to hear it in the context of a track because I can't keep up with that. Like it's not that I can't write a track, but I can't write it during the short interval of time I have in my life to devote to this swim lane, you know.
Mm.
And there's a lot of people making it. Like Pete Thorne from YouTube is always an amazing track. He actually was the tour. I think he's a touring guitarist for Chris Cornell
Oh,
years ago.
wow.
He's amazing. And some of my friends, William John Bennett III, he's a guitar account on Instagram, and he always writes a great track and puts it together. Jamie Morrissey is another cool account to follow. He's constantly covering Zeppelin or Hendrix and doing a great. And he plays all the drums, not just on a MIDI controller, but like literally on like an electronic drum kit. And he'll film himself playing bass and drums and guitar, and then edit them all together. So you see three of him playing every part, and it's like, that's freaking amazing. Like, I
Yeah.
love to explore that, but I am out of time, and I have to be at peace with, this is the way I'm spending my time, you know, while also pushing myself to mutate what I'm doing to be 1% better every day. And it's not necessarily 1% wider in breadth. It's 1% deeper.
Mm. Damn. That's very wise words.
Thank you, man.
Got a lot to think about.
Awesome. We've been talking for 2 hours. I can't believe it.
Yeah, we have. And we didn't really talk about photography at all, which is something that I wanted to. But
Did you have a question or two on that? I can probably try and not talk at length about it, but at least
Sure. Just kind of, how did you get into that? Well, that's maybe a long one, isn't it?
Well, I was exposed to photography mostly because my brother took a photography class in high school, and I was more into illustration at the time. But as I got into college and dabbled in engineering for the first 2 years, and then eventually switched to design, and I'm a graphic designer by trade. You can't really successfully have a graphic design career without considering how photography intermarries with photography. So typography and photography together are like a great example of magazine layout or website design, et cetera. And so I ended up taking some photography classes, not as a minor even, but just as electives. And then I got very into it. And this was, not even digital wholly. I was doing darkroom, black and white photography, and developing my own prints. And it was so fascinating. It's just so cool. Of course, nobody really has the time in today's society to only do analog development of black and white photography. Digital is a thing, and it has a speed to it and everything. But that put me in a world where I had at least learned the, all the principles of design elements in the zeitgeist, like things like pattern or symmetry, or these concepts of, they're not things that are written on every photo so you know what they are. They are the script behind the photo that led a photographer to choose a certain look and feel or a certain layout photo. And it's very helpful to me to, it's actually just like what I said about music theory. These are suggestions. They are not rules to box you in, but not knowing what other photographers have done throughout history is a guarantee that you're going to step into what they do unintentionally. Same thing as writing a song without knowing what Chuck Berry did, right? So from there, I took it in school, but then I started doing portrait photography, started doing a lot of macro photography. I think it's really fun, of like flowers or insects. And once you start looking at the world either on a landscape level or on a macro level, where you're studying the wrinkles on a leaf and giant water drops from the rain that just fell, there's so much in photography. And I think it helped me really look at the world. Like, suddenly I really like to travel, because when I'm on a trip now, it's not there's this whole layer of what am I shooting while I'm on the trip, which I find really fun. For what I do now for photography is not travel photography. It's not portraits as much, although I do take pictures of my kids and I have a lot of fun with portrait lenses. It's more about, how do these products look, right? How do these petals look in the right light, and how can I experiment with the way light interacts with this reflective finish or this matte finish? And Um, there's a lot of trial and error, and then eventually you get into a place where you start templatizing your style, and it's synesthetic. It's, synesthesia is this idea that photography is music, is
Mm.
cinematography. Once you learn the design gestalt principles of photography, it really maps into cinematography, because cinematography is just photography across time, right? And then you have to make choices like, where do I cut one camera angle to another? And so I bring my knowledge of Nashville numbers and chord changes to my playing to say, well, I'm only going to cut camera angles when I change chords. So, and that, a lot of design decision making is based on having a reason. What is the reason you made the choice that you did? And you can tell amateur photographers, amateur typographers, amateur musicians apart from seasoned professionals when they don't have a reason for what they do, I think. And so that's a big part of the decisions that I make. A lot of times I'll use a light like this and I'll put it behind the pedal, and then I'll backlight it. And so there's a glare in the camera lens. So if you follow my Instagram account, you'll notice a lot that you might notice that the light might be behind the subject sometimes to drive a moody, glary kind of look. Other times I'll light it from the side. And guitars in particular are beautiful. You see like the glint off the top right there?
Oh yeah.
Guitars are
Hmm.
beautiful when you light them as if they are a landscape with the sun coming up over the ridge.
Hmm.
There's a reason why photos look better at dawn or at like sundown, because the sun is so low, it drives the texture out of the entire landscape. And if you can think about landscape photography, but the landscape is a guitar or a product, you can really drive a lot of emotion instead of just lighting it from the top where it's very flat, for instance. So
Wow. I didn't know that.
yeah, the
Huh.
next time you shoot photos of anything, try and light it from an angle that's across the surface, and you will get, it may not be the right choice for a photo of a family member, because you will end up driving out um, divots in their skin or blemishes, because that's what the
Yeah.
sun does early in the day across a vineyard, right? It drives texture amongst the vines and long shadows. But if you're
Yeah.
going to shoot like an album cover of a band, like, and it's dark and moody music, I would highly recommend driving light across a surface instead of
Mm.
lighting from the front. Or you could backlight and make them all mysterious with light behind them, and then have a subtle spotlight across their faces so that they aren't just shadows. They have a little bit of depth, you know. So this is how you have to think. You have to be able to picture how light affects a subject and what directional lighting does. And sometimes it's many lights. To me, it's almost like working with microphones in the audio.
Yeah, definitely. There's always a parallel between light and sound,
Yep.
and outside of reverberation or resonance doesn't often happen really with light. But yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Damn, now I know some things about photography.
There you go. I would say
Awesome.
the same way that music drives you to have chills, and then investigate what it is about that that's giving you chills from a music theory perspective, so you can use it for yourself. If you're trying to learn photography, um, photography doesn't give me chills the same way that music does, but it imparts a sense of. This sounds really weird, but a great photo will say "shh" to me. It'll
Hmm.
be like quiet, like it should take your breath away for a moment and impart a stillness. And there's something about that photo that's doing that, whether it's the way it's lit, the way it's edited, the way it's cropped, the layout. There's a million different gestalt principles of what does that. But I get inspired by looking at other people's photography. And then I try and divorce their execution from the technique that got them there, and then bring that into my work. This is the same thing as music theory from a song, borrowing a technique and then removing the context and reusing it for yourself. So
100%. Well, now my brain is in a state of wonder. I feel like I have to take a walk and let this sit. But if there's just one thing that you want people to know about regarding yourself, your business, or a cause that you want to support, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, feel free to come by Instagram, check out Edge of Breakup, all one word, no underscores. Check out YouTube, same name, Edge of Breakup, same handle. I'm on Threads. I am on TikTok, although TikTok is pretty much a carbon copy of what you're going to see on Instagram at this point. I don't do original stuff for TikTok. So would love to see you. Drop me a line. Let me know you heard this podcast. And if you ever want to talk music theory, no charge for that. I'll talk your ears off. So, but yeah, it'd be great to meet some of the folks who listen to this podcast. And if you're into guitar, certainly there's no depth that we can't go to on my channel about that kind of stuff. So
Beautiful.
thanks for listening. And thanks again, Tristan. I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sean. And those links will be in the description below. We'll see you guys next time for the Voice Break podcast. Have a good night.
Thank you.